You're on.
Hello everyone, my name is David Beasley. I've had a lifetime of writing, and the Hearthside hearings has graciously consented to allow me to tell you about myself and my writing, actually, which is the more important. I divided this talk up into 10 different parts, and part 1 is going to be beginnings, bloody and political. Now, bloody doesn't necessarily refer to me, but it refers to a book I wrote a few years ago called From Bloody Beginnings, Richard Beasley's Upper Canada. And it's the history of Upper Canada, starting about the time of the American Revolution and carrying us right through to the end of Upper Canada's 1841. And the end of Richard Beasley too. He died in 1842. But his lifespan was very appropriate to telling the story, and I put it in his voice. He was the first settler in Hamilton, which was at that time in 1777 was called Burlington Heights, and some of you may know where Dundurn Castle is. It was built on top of his home, and Mr. McNabb, who built it, used his front door. Well, he was my great-great-great-grandfather. And so I'd like to speak about that book first of all. So we have Beginnings Political as well. And here is a painting. Now that's supposedly of Richard. And no one had any idea what he looked like. And this is in the Richard Beasley Primary School in Hamilton. And it hangs there. You see, all they knew about him was that he was a fur trader. And I must say that in local history in grade 6, I first heard the name and became very interested. And up until that time, I was a very poor student. I was more interested in play, but I became very interested in history. And by the time I reached grade 8, they were kind enough to give me the history award for the city when I graduated. So that shows what an inspiring name can do. Now, Richard Beasley's ancestry, here is a picture of Albany in 1750. His grandfather arrived there from where I don't know. I know that he was about 40 years before. He was born in London, England, and he must have had quite a career because he was quite well educated in those days, and he immediately started teaching, and he approached many of the slaves, the ones who were more interested in education, and asked them if they'd like to learn the catechism. In other words, would you like to learn to read and write? Which, of course, was taboo for anyone attempting that. They'd hang people who tried to teach the slaves. So they all came to his house every night, and especially on weekends, for years. And the reason we know this is because he wrote to the Society for Spreading the Gospel in London, and a couple of his letters survive. He'd asked for some money. I think they tried to send him £10, but the money didn't arrive because the ship couldn't get there the first year. He possibly did receive his £10. But at any rate, you can see that education was a part of Richard Beasley's background. And in growing up in Albany, the book, almost a quarter of the book, deals with the Revolution and the problems. So, of course, they were loyalists. But Richard Beasley's father, Henry, was a member of the Night Guard, and he was in the militia, and like many loyalists, they couldn't be outspoken. But his sister had married an Englishman who was quite prominent. He had built Cartwright's Inn, the most important inn there. He was a merchant. He was allied with Sir William Johnson, and he was an outspoken loyalist. And his son, Richard Cartwright Jr., has a great role to play. He was one of the first intellectuals in Canada, and he built up Kingston eventually. So there is what John Beasley arrived at, and here's a picture we finally have discovered of Richard Beasley. At least we think it is. This was sent to me from someone in Denver, Colorado, because it had been initialed CHB, and it was a charcoal drawing. CHB is Charlotte Hills Beasley. It was my great-grandmother. And I had put out a book of her watercolors, and this lady had seen some of them on the internet and said, oh, same CHB. And it was dated 60, so it's 1860, and I'd assumed that she had done that portrait. She might have known Richard Beasley, probably did when he was an old man. So that's why he's looking very old there. Any rate, that's ways. And there, of course, is Burlington Heights. Here, the early part of it. This is, there's Coote's Paradise in there, and it's very primitive. You see all the trees growing there. And he was below the heights, his first cabins and so forth. He was a fur trader. He was there, and he was also in Toronto from 1777 onwards. And he was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War as assistant commissary, acting commissary. He had to supply Fort Niagara with food. If the ships bringing the food in from Europe, for instance, were attacked by privateers, or the lakes and the rivers had frozen over in the wintertime, the people would have starved if it weren't for the large number of commissaries who had to trade with the Indians and bring food into them. So, and here's a later, around 1812, at the time of the war, and the various aspects. They have his house named here. He was he had built about 1799 his house on the top of the escarpment there, and it still had his houses below, down here, and the wharf and so forth. Coote's Paradise was named after a man who stayed in Richard Beasley's Inn, which was down here, and used to shoot the birds. So many wild birds. Beautiful. It was a paradise there, so that's why they called it Coote's Paradise. And actually, it was a name for Dundas until Hat Brothers came along and built their Dundas mills, and that's why Dundas has the name it has now. There is Fort Niagara. Now, this is a drawing by David H. Smith, who was a Speaker of the Assembly, and Richard Beasley succeeded him as Speaker. He at this time was in the English military, and he'd done this drawing. Now you'll see all the houses here. You wouldn't see those today because the water is much higher. But that is where the traders were. And Richard Beasley had joined with Cartwright in the merchant trade and the Laurentian trade. And that's where he lived for a while, around 1780s, down in these cabins. Before, when he was a commissary, he lived across the way in shacks, where the commissary shacks were across the river. So that's what Fort Niagara, and there's Colonel John Butler. He was the superintendent of the Indians, and he had grown up in the Mohawk Valley and was very important in controlling the tribes, the Iroquois and the Mohawks. He spoke all their languages and knew their customs very intimately, and was trusted by Sir William Johnson, who was given the responsibility for all the northern territory of the Indians. And he developed Butler's Rangers. Now, you've heard of the Butler's Rangers making war out of Niagara. Well, so young Cartwright, the son of the innkeeper, who was such an intellectual, became his secretary. And they raided out of Niagara, and I talk about that in the book, and with the Indians. And young Cartwright was so disgusted by the type of warfare, the brutality of it all, that he soon gave up, and that's why he started in business and became very successful, along with this man who's called Robert Hamilton. You see, he's a very wise-looking fellow. He certainly knew how, he was from Scotland, and he certainly knew how to develop his businesses. He married the eldest daughter of John Askin, the great fur trader in Detroit, and of course immediately had connections with Montreal and the merchants there and the trading business. And he was partnered with Cartwright, and then Richard Beasley and Peter Smith in what's now Port Hope were partnered with them, and they developed the whole region. But he had so much power. He was put on the executive, actually the legislative council, which when Governor Simcoe arrived, he set up the legislature. After 1791, when the Constitution for Upper Canada was approved, they developed the legislature, and there was the assembly, which men were voted to, and that's where Richard Beasley had a seat. And there was a legislative council, which was the people were appointed to, and then there was the executive council, much smaller, which was like a cabinet. And Cartwright and Hamilton refused to take seats on it because they would have had to agree with the governor, which they didn't want to so many times.